Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's discussion about China's growing economic and political influence in Europe. We're joined today by two experts who know China well and who have tracked these developments in Europe. Melissa Chan is an Emmy-nominated journalist who divides her time between Los Angeles and Berlin. She's reported from around the world and has most recently been covering China and its influence beyond its borders. Melissa, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also joined by Dr. Mareike Ohlberg. She is a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She also leads the Stockholm China Forum. And before joining GMF, she worked as an analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. Mareike, herzlich willkommen.
Happy to be here.
So both bios have just been posted in the chat, and we can dive into our conversation. I think, as we all know, China's rapid global rise has created challenges for the United States, for the European Union, and also for individual European countries. And as China's economic and political footprint has expanded, Beijing seems to be providing an alternative to the West and offers some opportunities for rapid economic development. You're both currently based in Berlin, and I'd like to start by asking each of you about your assessment of how China is expanding its economic and political influence in Europe. Melissa, maybe let's start with you and get your take on where things are, and then come to you, Mareike.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think the very premise of your question reveals how people tend to think about China's influence beyond its borders. You talk about the economic and political, but I would want to suggest that it goes beyond that, right? So I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I think on first assessment, though, the first thing I'd say, which should be obvious, which is the fact that not all of it is necessarily bad, right? In fact, a lot of the influence economically can be quite positive. And I'm sure with this audience here, you've read a lot about China's economic and political influence. Certainly with the Belt and Road Initiative, things like the Greek port in Piraeus. Perhaps you haven't read so much, but this is the thing that I most recently reported and wrote about was the Shanghai Fudan University satellite campus in Budapest that's being planned, and that is kind of de facto replacing Central European University and Hungary. So it really runs the gamut when you think about infrastructure. As we all know, network infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and also things like in academia. Specifically with Germany, since we're in Berlin, I think the big influence, though, is economic. There's a tremendous amount of trade between the two countries. And I often think about this. For me, the influence in Germany, I mean, Germany believes it has a lot of multinational companies. But when you look at, for example, the car makers, half of Volkswagen's sales take place in China. 1 in 3 German cars are sold in China. I'd argue a lot of German car makers mostly are not a multinational company, but are a company that is Europe-based and China-based, maybe a little bit of the US. And I just point this out just to emphasize just how big that relationship with China is, and that at the end of the day, money talks, which means that we do have a case, which I think you alluded to, where we have, for example, a small country like Lithuania bleeding and making a ton of noise about China's human rights record, and Germany, the largest economy and the biggest political player in the EU, not really talking about pushing back as much. And, you know, I moved here 4 years ago. What struck me is how much this country constantly talks about its history of concentration camps. And the terrible thing that I see when I look at the German relationship with China is that often German political players are doing their best to pretend that there are or they don't want to talk about it. I mean, they acknowledge it, but they don't really want to talk about the at least 400 documented detention camps in China's far west. And that is really awkward, I think, when I'm sitting here in Berlin. On an anecdotal level, and this, I mean, I would love if Mareike knows anything about polling. My personal experience is that the ordinary German citizen is ahead of this than their politicians when it comes to China. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later as well. With this new coalition in their coalition deal document, they did specifically talk about Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. Now, your original question about the economic and political influence, I wanted to sort of veer away from that because I do sense that the audience here really knows a lot about the political and economic. They've read about it, right? What I want to bring up is the cultural. It's something that I've written about, of course, too. When I first got to Berlin, I was struck by this. There are a lot of Chinese nationals studying in Europe and hoping to find work here and eventually a pathway to permanent residency. And especially in Berlin, perhaps because of the arts and cultural atmosphere here, I did sort of get caught up in this community of Chinese creatives in exile. And this too, I see as a way of China's influence, right? In the sense that the state is so authoritarian that anyone who wants to do anything creative, who wants the freedom to write literature, to create art, do not feel like they have the space and instead have to find places like Berlin to sort of pursue their Chinese art. And so you have this kind of unusual migration. They're certainly not as big a story as the big economic decisions made between two states, but I want people to think about China's influence in different ways and less direct ways than the political and the economic that gets written about so much. And one last thing on that, there are, of course, other exiles in Germany and in Europe, particularly people from Hong Kong. Just a few days ago, I was in another talk, and a Hong Kong activist in exile talked about, and she was based in Hamburg. She talked about realizing that she was being followed, right, around the city. And it does not surprise me that there are Chinese agents in Europe, but this kind of intimidation, I mean, certainly if she realized she was being followed, they were letting her know, right? These are specialists in surveilling. If they don't want you to know, you will never know. That's the one thing I learned when I was based in China. So we have to think and understand about Chinese agents, real 007 stuff on European soil. And I'm not entirely sure Europe is really particularly, I don't have a lot of confidence in state intelligence in Europe, but that's another thing altogether. But I do hope that the internal sort of security of respective states are aware that this kind of thing is happening and it's only going to get worse.
Well, Melissa, thank you for, you've put a lot out there, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of pointing out that it is so much more than just the economic and political dimension, that the cultural dimension is there, but that at the end of the day, it's not just an economic concern, but really very much a security concern that one should be thinking about and addressing. You know, I thought your comment too about German automotive companies was particularly interesting, because I've found myself when speaking with representatives from German automobile companies, asking them if they see themselves as German companies with a global reach or global companies with their roots in Germany. And increasingly, they're saying it's the latter rather than the former, for exactly the same kinds of reasons that you're talking about. That you know, they obviously have markets all over the place, they have plants all over the place. Due to global supply chains, they need to take the global context sometimes more seriously than their German origin story. There are a number of points that you touched on that I'd like to come back to, perhaps a little bit later in the conversation, particularly how the new German government might approach China. But before we do that, let me bring you into the conversation, Mareike. Obviously, you've been following these issues as well, and thinking a lot about China's influence both in Germany but also in other parts of Europe. And so I'd be delighted to sort of get your take on how you see China's sort of expanding influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also on other levels.
Right. Thanks so much, Steve. And I think Melissa also already pointed out a number of important points that I want to come back to later on in the discussion as well. But for now, I think for this initial introduction, I kind of want to take a step back and focus on three things. One is, why is this even happening? Like, what's the goal here? Why even do this influence work? The second point that I want to make is, what is Europe's role to the extent that we can say it? Of course, it has many, many different roles from the perspective of the party, but how is Europe envisioned here? And then I want to go a little bit into the question of, Europe, big European countries versus small European countries. And let's just say I have strong opinions about how some of these things are framed, especially in Germany, which tends to look at, Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and tends to point at those countries as the biggest problem, which I view quite differently. So maybe let's start with a goal. I don't usually talk about Chinese influence or Chinese interference because essentially it's about the Chinese Communist Party. It is a party project that is led by the party state and that is motivated by the party state's interests, right? What are those interests? You can always boil them down to regime security. It's always about making the world safer for the party itself. And in this particular case, the idea is that the current world that we live in is fundamentally unsafe for an authoritarian party such as the CCP. This was, of course, especially true in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, where the CCP found itself in a world like we're the only big communist party around. All the alliances of the world are America-centric. We're essentially encircled. When we put something out in the media, nobody believes us. People don't think that our government system is good. So we're essentially internationally isolated. And, the first step that the party took was to make sure that, Chinese people are more insulated from that, give people more patriotic education. Once you open up to the internet, build up censorship in the form of, what's colloquially known as the Great Firewall. But then in the long run, the calculation here is we can't keep fighting hostile ideas at our borders. We need to fundamentally change the discourse and the international system at the international level in order to be safer in the long run. We need to have more discourse power. We need to have more countries that are willing to align themselves with our interests, might not be formal alliances like the US system of alliances, but that are willing to side with us on many issues. And we need to figure out how to make alliances more China-centric. And in a way, this is where the Belt and Road Initiative comes in, because it proposes a model of connectivity that is essentially China-centric, where China builds relationships with various countries in which it is usually the stronger party between the two countries, right? So that is very China-centric. Everything runs to China. Everything is centered around Chinese interests. So this is part of that effort. And of course, you have attempts to change discourses, whether that is through the media, whether that is through party-to-party diplomacy, whether that is through intimidation, whether that is through lobbying at the business network level, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the basic idea, make the world safer for the party. Now, what's Europe's role? I think Europe, as far as you can generalize, has a dual role. The first role is that Europe is still considered kind of the little brother of the United States. It's an ally, and China, being the Chinese Communist Party, being very much focused on big power competition between the US and China, needs to ensure that US allies are separated from the US. This can be, a several-step process. It doesn't have to be that everybody needs to side with China right away. But you first want to get all the allies in a situation where they'll say, what, we're staying neutral, we're staying out of this conflict, we don't want to pick sides. And then in the next step, once you're more entangled with Chinese interests, you might eventually side with China. But as a step one, it's good enough if you say, we're keeping out of this. And this is a stage where we're, in some cases, already are, where a lot of countries are saying, don't make us choose. So in a way, that's already been quite successful, right? The second role that I think that Europe has in many ways is as a legitimizing force. And we saw this when, Italy signed the Belt and Road Initiative Agreement. This was shrouded out as like a big European country has signed this. So who are you in Laos, Cambodia, and ASEAN countries and other countries to think that this is bad? Like even the Europeans are on board. So it's in a way a legitimizing force also when you get European politicians to repeat certain talking points that the CCP puts out there. That's supposed to legitimize Chinese interests, both for Chinese audiences, but also for international audiences in other areas of the world. So this is the big motivator, and this is the piece that this dual role that Europe plays, and why the CCP spends this energy on Europe. Now, the third point I wanted to make, and then I'll shut up because I think we have a lot to discuss in a moment, is the question of big country Europe versus smaller country Europe. And as I already indicated, in Germany, there's this tendency to say, well, our biggest problem in China is, 17, formerly 17, now 16 plus 1, and, China trying to divide the EU by mixing EU countries with non-EU countries and by buying off all those countries in Central and Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe. And there's a point to that. And I do think this mixing and matching and putting EU and non-EU countries together in certain frameworks and in building up those networks, that is supposed to split in a way. But if you look at a lot of the reactions to CCP influence interference approaches, the reactions have been a lot healthier in much of Central and Eastern Europe. And when we look at the Baltic states, this is absolutely obvious. Which country is currently picking a big fight with China? It's Lithuania. The other Baltic states are not quite as far along, but they're also more likely to put up some resistance. The Czech Republic, some quite significant changes have taken place there. Even if you look at Poland, it's not all pro-China voices, right? So this whole narrative of Central and Eastern Europe, or the problem in Europe, doesn't really hold up. And in part, that's because, a lot of the promises of investment from China have actually been big disappointments and haven't really come through to the extent that a lot of countries were hoping. So there's been a lot of disenchantment and a lot of resistance. Whereas I think the bigger countries, such as Germany, France to some extent, are actually a little bit more problematic because they are the most exposed to the Chinese economy, still not vastly exposed like Australia or New Zealand, but the most in Europe. And they are the most likely to stand up for initiatives such as the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. That was a very German affair with, some French assistance. And that was essentially, this project of the big European power is very much against the will of many, many smaller states in Europe. So I think when we look at CCP influence in Europe, it really makes sense to look beyond the fringes and beyond the small ones and to look at some of the central players. Economic groups that are politically well represented, that have a lot of lobbying power. And this is a murky world. There's a lot that you cannot find out about how this exactly works. But I think when you look at what succeeds in terms of what China is doing, this is their biggest success story, keeping the German automotive industry on board, making sure that this continues to have effects on German China policy, but also on European China policy via Germany. And this, I think, is where we need to look more and basically focus more on that and try to figure out how to counter that more effectively and make sure that this becomes more transparent and less murky. I'll stop here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Mareike, thank you so much. That was terrific, and you covered a lot of ground. While you were speaking, I saw Melissa constantly nodding her head. So before I ask follow-up questions, Melissa, is there anything that you would like to add or comment on from what we just heard from Mareike?
I mean, just to piggyback and underscore, I mean, essentially the divide and conquer is the strategy that Beijing really likes to do. They don't do it just at the diplomatic level. Frankly, they do it with journalists, like the Foreign Press Corps in Beijing, right? This is something they do a lot with, and they understand how the EU works, right? If they can just befriend one country, that's all they really need to incapacitate EU foreign policy. And we see that with China's relationship with Hungary. The other thing that the theme that I took from Mareike's comments is that she's also pushing back on some common narratives when we talk about China's influence in Europe in this case, which is the sort of let's look at the Central European, Eastern European states and how they're totally bought by China, when in reality, France and Germany and some of the things that Macron has said about China definitely raises eyebrows. And they are the biggest players that can move things. And yes, absolutely, that trade agreement they tried to get the EU to jump on board is very indicative of that. So yes, I'm all for breaking narratives, getting people to think differently.
Well, so thinking about this notion of dividing and conquering, which seems to be very much a strategy that China has taken, China has really tried to take advantage of some of the local vulnerabilities or even weaknesses, particularly in some of the smaller European countries in Southeastern Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. And I think it makes sense to drill down on that just a little bit more, because that's where I think some people have observed there's a bit of an Achilles heel when it comes to China's influence in Europe. Mareike, perhaps you first. How do you see China's engagement in that part of Europe? You talked a little bit about the fact that there's some disenchantment at this point, that perhaps China hasn't lived up to some of the expectations that people had in those countries. But let's explore that a little bit further.
Yeah, and the point was not so much to say that everything that the Chinese government does in those regions is automatically, not important or has no impact at all. That's not the point. My point was really more to say there is more than just Europe's China problem is bigger than just Central and Eastern Europe. That said, I feel like in many regions, in many countries, there is now an interesting dynamic where, the Chinese government has had basically the government on its side for a while. If you look at the Czech Republic, if you look at Hungary, there's very strong support from, the highest government level. But you have actually now counter movements against that, which gets mixed up with domestic political movements and domestic political issues. And I think this is a key point that we see in all of this. Wherever the Chinese government has succeeded, it's usually been because, government have been able to tie it to some domestic agenda, Viktor Orban speaks up for China. It's not for his love of China. It's because he has other domestic agendas and he has his own issues with the European Union. So he can then use the China card to, cause trouble for the European Union on issues where he has disagreements with other European countries to begin with. And I'm honestly not entirely sure how well the Chinese side understands all of these disputes, but certainly good at exploiting them ad hoc and making use of them where they arise. At the same time, and this is the interesting part, the domestic dynamics in these countries now come into play, where of course opposition politicians, and we have seen this particularly, in Hungary and Budapest, position themselves in opposition to their national leaders, and therefore automatically you're now run on platforms that are, against the food on campus in Budapest or against the China policy that the national governments have been pursuing. So you get this really interesting dynamic that is, of course, all about domestic politics, but is where China becomes a platform where politicians can use that to argue. And I think it's led to some interesting dynamics that perhaps people in Beijing weren't necessarily foreseeing, because my sense still is that, especially for Europe, and less so than for most countries closer to China's vicinity, the playbook that the party uses in Europe is still it's very formulaic. It's a special type, you try to get the top elites. If you can't get them, you try to get local elites and kind of use this approach of using the countryside to surround the city. So finding others that'll convince that can then put pressure on a national government. But it's not based on a very, very detailed understanding of local political context. And I feel like, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, and to a much more limited degree also in Southern Europe, this is now beginning to actually have counter effects and is basically becoming a problem for the CCP in those countries, not having a very good grasp of the local context and basically relying on the same playbook in different contexts.
Melissa, is there anything you'd like to add to that? I mean, you talked a little bit earlier about sort of efforts that the Chinese have undertaken to sort of win the hearts and minds, if you will, of Europeans, that it's not just about the Belt and Road Initiative, that it's not just about infrastructure, it's about more than that. And of course, it's not just true in Europe, but in Africa as well, in other parts of the world. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that Mareike was just raising in terms of this campaign, if you will, to try to engage people and give them a different viewpoint when it comes to China?
I mean, I think, first of all, I second what Mareike said, that in certain cases, Hungary and Budapest being one of them, and also Prague and the federal government on the other, some opposition politicians have essentially used the cozy relationship with China as a weapon, and really being sort of critical or putting a critical eye on China has become a litmus test to a country's sort of commitment to democracy, right? That's how the local politicians are playing it. And I do think it's very interesting to see that there is a lot of this domestic stuff happening that I don't think the Chinese necessarily foresaw. One thing that I was thinking about as Mareike was talking about was she talked about, the situation where the EU is forced to choose, right? And then they don't want to choose. And that then putting them in this neutral spot is actually a win for China. I want to sort of got me thinking about terminology, because I think some of the popular terms are the new Cold War, right? And there's a lot of talk about that, and whether the US is doing something that contributes to the new Cold War, whether the EU, whatever policy it does, any move it makes, whether it contributes or detracts from creating a new Cold War. And I actually think that term is a gift for Chinese propaganda. They can keep accusing the US or the West of starting a new Cold War, even as they are sometimes just as aggressive with their policy to contribute to cooler relations with democratic states, right? Like I can't imagine a more aggressive situation than unfortunately having a virus that originates in your territory and then doing a massive cover-up so that really the world will never really know what the hell happened. And then start an aggressive campaign to say that actually this virus came from Ecuadorian shrimp, or possibly a US military camp. In fact, that it's the Americans that brought the virus to China. I mean, that's the narrative that's going on domestically in China. The vast majority of Chinese people, 1.4 billion people, believe that, right? I mean, that's pretty aggressive to me. So this whole terminology with the new Cold War, I think actually plays into China's hands more than anything. So that's something that I wanted to flag up is again, narrative, breaking narratives, and thinking about terminology. I mean, we can talk about at some point the Belt and Road Initiative as a label too, but maybe I'll stop here.
Well, so that's actually go ahead, Mareike.
I need to, unmute myself. Yeah, just a quick two fingers on that. I think that's a really important point to push back on this very common narrative of Cold War accusations, which I always say that, the problem here is that the old Cold War never really stopped for the party. It kind of continued because, after the Soviet Union collapsed, from the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, it was just that, they were still in a Cold War, just, a little bit lonelier. So they need to continue that. So this Cold War thinking is deeply, deeply in the minds of all the party cadres. This is how the world is framed. It's very much a zero-sum power competition between China and the United States. The thing that they always accuse the United States of is very much how the party views the world. It's very much Cold War thinking in terms of, our own ideological security vis-a-vis those bad Western ideas. And it's therefore, I think the Cold War framing is incredibly harmful. And I think it's also really important and I guess maybe as a European, I can say that because Europeans also make the same mistake, but especially for Americans, to be less America-centric about how the world functions. Like, other parties have agency. Other parties can make decisions that are independent of what the United States does. And in this particular case, this is exactly what's happening. The CCP has been planning independently of what the United States has been doing on its own terms, and what it's doing is not just all a reaction to what America is doing. But this is such a common talking point, is like, if only we were nicer to China, then all the reformers could come back into power and we would all be fine. Or if only we weren't provoking China so much, then we wouldn't have this conflict. And in this particular case, this is simply not what's happening.
So this issue around narrative is actually a perfect segue to raise another topic that a couple of people have already posed some questions on. Our conversation today is particularly timing because it was just this week that the European Commission unveiled the EU's Global Gateway Initiative. And this is a 300 billion infrastructure project, which the EU has not presented as a counterweight to the Belt and Road Initiative. But I personally wonder if there is any other way to interpret it. One of our viewers writes, can European initiatives like the Global Gateway materially compete with the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of scale of investment and influence in emerging markets? And another one of our viewers is curious as to what the reaction is in China to the Global Gateway. Do either of you have any thoughts on this new initiative and how we should try to put it in context and how the Chinese see it?
I mean, I'm sure we both do. Who wants to go first?
I assume you do too. Melissa, why don't you go first?
I mean, I had made a comment earlier that this is where I actually think Beijing screwed up. I was talking about labeling, right? For example, decoupling, right? Decoupling is a term that was used during the Trump administration for things he did with China. And it became very much an American thing. The Americans have decided to decouple, and this is just no way forward. When in fact, actually, China has been decoupling way earlier than the Americans. They just didn't call it decoupling, right? Like the way the policymakers in DC did, which was kind of frankly dumb. But I suppose that's it's a transparent, it's a more transparent society, right? So when you make policy, you have to talk about it. But in China, I mean, I remember sitting in China when Google was the #1 search engine in China. Does anyone remember that? I mean, crazy, right? To think about it, that it was #1. But, Google had to leave, Twitter, Facebook. I mean, what is that but decoupling, right? Beijing was doing that way earlier. They just didn't label it. So going to Belt and Road Initiative, I think this is where they got it wrong. They labeled it. Suddenly there was something that the world could respond to and combat. And frankly, if China hadn't called it the Belt and Road Initiative and just kept doing this stuff in Latin America and Africa, policymakers would still be debating about whether it's even happening or not, right? So now we have the Global Gateway Initiative in Europe and also in the United States, the Build Back Better World. It's a mouthful. I'll first speak to the American one, which is like, we can't even build our own infrastructure. Why are we remotely confident that as Americans we'd be able to build infrastructure elsewhere? And second of all, who wants our infrastructure based on the reputation it's had the last couple of decades? And so my question has always been, why are we playing the game on China's terms, where China is strong and frankly where the United States is weak? Right? I think when I travel around Europe, the infrastructure in Europe is much better. So perhaps there's more standing for Europe to try to do this kind of project. And I understand it's not just roads and trains, but also like digital infrastructure. But really a smarter response for both of these programs in the EU and the US would be like to really invest in and offer to other countries and developing states what the US or the European Union is good at, right? I mean, the Chinese are just really good at building bridges. Why are we competing with them on that? I mean, there's things that the US can bring, right? I would say encouraging startups in Africa and Latin America. I would say innovation, entrepreneurship, also innovation, entrepreneurship, and working with India, because that's a very exciting ecosystem right now, building incubators and things like that. So, and even entertainment, right? I mean, Netflix is so global now, like it's taking and investing in South Korean filmmakers to create television series that the world watches, right? I mean, when we talk about American soft power, I mean, this could be a natural extension of that isn't too forced. So I would not put too much confidence. I don't have that much confidence actually on both the US or EU schemes. And with the EU scheme, I would also say that my understanding is that the 300 billion euros, a lot of it is already like existing commitments. It's just like repackaged into a pretty bow tie by Brussels. And so it's essentially putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, maybe that's a little harsh, but like, you know, a lot of it is already committed stuff. So.
Yeah, maybe to add to that. So I'm less concerned about the amount than some other people have been, you know, it's like what's 300 billion against however many trillion. I'm slightly less concerned about that because one, the exact amount of that's been invested in the BRI is very murky. And depending on which data you use, you can come up with very different figures and with very inconsistent figures. And also, you know, so I'm less concerned about that and more concerned about, you know, what can you actually fund with it? And is it gonna work in the local context? I mean, I think one of the reasons why we have this debt trap diplomacy talk, and I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't think that this is a grand master plan to and create debt for countries, but I do think that a lot is going wrong on the ground that ends up in those situations where debt is created, is because, you know, it's sometimes Belt and Road projects might fund not economically viable projects. You know, you don't need this bridge here. This bridge is not going to bring the money back. So you're going to end up with this debt situation. And, you know, can you fund that stuff with European money? I hope not. I hope you cannot fund economically unviable projects with those. So you are still going to have those projects where if you have a politician that wants to do this as a project, you know, they're not going to take European money for that. So the question is, whose money are they going to take? And if China continues to be willing to fund those kinds of things, which there is, I think, reason to believe why China itself might be becoming more cautious in funding some of these projects, because again, I don't think the goal in most cases is to accumulate debt for those countries and then seize assets. But there's a bigger problem at play with some of the infrastructure that is simply not viable. And what do you do in those cases? So it's a big problem where I think to some degree, I still think it's good that they have the initiative. I don't have very high hopes. I think there's a lot of things that can go wrong with these initiatives, as has gone wrong with previous initiatives in the past that didn't really lead anywhere. But I'm not so much concerned about this. I'm more concerned about like, what's this going to look like in real life when this meets the projects that, you know, some countries or some parties or some individual people in some countries want funded. And I don't think that there is a very good or very easy solution for that.
I mean, to pick up on that, I mean, I think the devil really is in the details of what's actually done with this. I thought it was interesting to see that the German ambassador to the European Union talked about the Global Gateway as a mechanism or a vehicle to make the EU a more effective geopolitical player, quote, right? Effective geopolitical player. And that there's this ambition that Europe will play a larger role on the world stage. Some of the other things that I was also reading related to the Global Gateway talked about how Europe might combine initiatives like that with its European Green Deal to try to attack or take on climate change, and that this is something that could, have implications far beyond Europe, and in other parts of the world where China is also seeking influence, like in Africa. So while I understand some of your hesitancy, Melissa, about how much of a impact this will actually have, and to what degree it's kind of a repackaging of funding that has already been committed. I do think that there's kind of an opportunity perhaps here, and certainly a signal that Europe is trying to take on some responsibility, which kind of leads to another topic that I want to touch on, which is going from the European level to the German level. Obviously, in the coming days, a new government will take office in Germany, and as we've seen in the coalition agreement, the three parties of the traffic light coalition seem to recognize that China is at the same time a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And so the question that a lot of people have is, will this new government be more hawkish on China than the previous government was? We've heard some signals of that from Annalena Baerbock, who's probably going to be the next foreign minister. Mareike, how do you think the new government will address China?
So I think my take on this is a window of opportunity which we should take without having any hopes for any revolutionary changes in Germany's China policy. I don't think anything's going to change massively overnight. This is not how the German government functions. They don't make very radical changes. But I do think that some things have changed that open up a window of opportunity to push for and the goal here doesn't have to be to have a super hawkish German foreign policy. It's not necessarily what I want, but to push it into a direction that holds the Chinese government to account where it needs to be held to account, where it does stand up more for its own interests than other European interests. And again, there's this window of opportunity because we have two parties in the current coalition that have come out very strongly on China prior to the elections. Of course, they did that as opposition parties, and there's always the difference between what an opposition party does versus what a party does when it's in government. However, they have come out with some very strong statements, and there are some people who I think will have an interest in making at least some of that a reality. You have in the coalition agreement phrasing such as, we need to reduce our strategic dependency on China. I think that's, that's stuff where you can follow up with them, a couple of months from now, you can ask, what are you doing about that? So it gives us all the stuff in the coalition agreement that's mentioned, gives us opportunity to ask them, what are you concretely doing to put this into action? The other reasons why I am mildly optimistic that this is a window of opportunity is one, the discourse has already changed quite a bit in Germany, and you've already had parts of German industry push for change. And that's a trend that, especially as China is not opening up anytime soon, is only going to get stronger. You're not going to get automotive clamoring for a more hawkish China policy, but you do have in other industrial sectors, you have that. And that's probably going to get stronger rather than weaker. You also have a situation where, in the last couple of years, whenever Germany did something very stupid on China policy, whether that was on Huawei or on anything else, it was often an intervention from nowhere from the chancellery. Mm-hmm. And yes, China policy will probably still be made in the chancellery rather than the Foreign Office because it's big power politics. But you're going to have a new chancellor that hasn't been in office for 15 years and whose ability to intervene, the Deus ex machina, and now everything changes because I say so. Olaf Scholz's ability to do that is going to be constrained by the simple fact that he hasn't been in office for 15 years. Right. So there are going to be more voices coming in and other ministries who will have probably more say than they had in recent years under a chancellor that had very much consolidated her power after being in office for 15 years.
So, Mareike, perhaps as a footnote to that, taking it beyond Berlin, one of our viewers is curious how the new German coalition government might handle European cohesion in the process of being somewhat more hawkish on China.
I mean, I think again, you're gonna keep having issues such as individual countries perhaps preventing certain statements from happening. You know, as long as China only needs to convince one to stop a statement from happening, that's going to keep happening. And I don't think that they're going to be able to get rid of unanimity in that case. So they're just going to have to keep working around that. That said, I mean, Hungary went along on the sanctions. They later said, oh, we wanted to stop it, but they didn't. So they went along. So I think actually if you have the big European countries on board, you can actually achieve quite a bit in Europe in terms of concrete actions. Doesn't mean that there won't be instances where an individual country will be persuaded by the Chinese government to stop something or to water something down. But again, the bigger problem here, I think, are the bigger countries like Germany and like France. We'll see what happens after the elections in France next year. So once you have them in line and kind of on the same page with regard to the China policy, you can achieve a lot. So I am, again, mildly optimistic that this will have a positive impact on European China policy as well.
Thank you for that. Melissa, I'd like to shift directions with you just a little bit and pose a question that one of our viewers has asked. He writes, do you see any opportunities for addressing human rights violations in China without destroying economic ties with China, particularly given how important China is for Germany's economic survival? You know, you were talking a little bit about the automotive industry, about the strong trade ties between China and Germany in particular. How do the human rights issues factor into that?
So I guess the question, to reframe it, is it, I guess the answer perhaps is you can't have, you can only pick one, right? Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Look, the human rights issues at the end of the day are inside China's borders mostly. And short of rolling into Xinjiang to stop the detention camps, it's been something that I've certainly thought about how we can stop this, right? I mean, as we're sitting here, there are people in detention centers right now, right? Separated from their families and possibly have been separated for months, if not longer. And just having that thought is just, for me, really unbearable, to be honest, as another human being. So how can you make a state stop that, right? And really, again, I just don't think we're at a point where we're going to roll in militarily and as the world and try to save these people. And so what leverage is there is except the economic, right, with China. So I do think that I mean, Germany and Europe, these are democracies, right? The basis of so much of all of this is based on human rights. And if you don't stand by the very things you've invented, frankly, systems that you've invented, right, from the ancient Greeks to the Enlightenment, then I don't know what you stand for. I'm not suggesting that all trade stops, but Germany, France, the EU has a lot of leverage that it can use. And it's just a question of conscience versus money. Often as a journalist, you see that money wins, unfortunately. So I don't know who's listening out there, but those who are in the business world, I mean, we saw Ray Dalio just in the last few days on CNBC try to talk his way out of the detention centers by saying he just follows the laws, and in any country where he does business with. Sure, to an extent, but we grew up learning that there are laws you can't just follow, especially in Germany, right? We just follow the laws. We've heard this. So yeah, I would just say that the answer is that European states have a lot more leverage that they should use and exercise. I'm not advocating a complete abolishment of trade, but There's a lot that can be done to stop something that horrific.
So when thinking about this economic leverage, I'd like to come back to something that's come up earlier in our conversation, which, as a reminder to everybody, this time last year, or actually a little bit later, but in December of last year, as Germany's presidency of the European Council was coming to an end, a major investment agreement between Europe and China was agreed to, but it hasn't been ratified yet by the nation states. And so the question is, do you think that this that this investment agreement will be ratified, particularly by this new German government that's going to be taking office next week? I don't know if either of you, if both of you want to say something, or if just one of you wants to say something on that.
I mean, I can give it a try. I don't generally like to look into the future because if you'd asked me 3 years ago where I would see myself today, I wouldn't have said locked into a global pandemic for almost the third year. So obviously our predictions have limits. I think for now it's in the freezer. Right now you can't touch it in Brussels. So the parliament also has to act on it first. The parliament's not going to touch it right now, not until sanctions against parliamentarians are lifted. That said, I don't trust that it's dead before I've buried it myself. These things have a way to sneak back, and then and at a moment when there's not a lot of attention, which was actually the same case for the first announcement that it was concluded in principle, which was done over Christmas and New Year's. There's a reason why you do it at that time, because people aren't paying attention. So then I'm sure there's going to be attempts to revive it. I currently don't think it can go anywhere unless there is a game-changing event somewhere that will lead people to significantly reconsider, simply because the overall atmosphere in the relationship is now quite bad, not just because of the sanctions, but also because of what's been happening with Lithuania and a number of other issues. I don't see it right now. Again, things can change. Things can I think people are going to try to sneak it back in because there's still interest in concluding it, but I'd be more surprised if it were ratified than if it wasn't, for sure.
Thank you for that, Mareike. And I understand you're somewhat reluctant to forecast too far into the future, but we're really happy to be talking with the two of you as experts who are cognizant of the trends and can help us understand what to watch. And so I'd like to maybe come to a close with two viewer questions, and I'd like to get your perspectives, each of your perspectives on these two questions. And the first one might require a little bit of anticipating what might come in the future. One of our viewers writes that Europe and the United States seem to be aligning much more closely than was earlier the case on issues like human rights, investment screening, and countering unfair trade practices. And she writes, will Europe's China policy end up converging with US views on the subject, or will Europe still try to seek a more moderate middle ground? Mareike, you're nodding, so do you want to go first on that?
I can go first on that. I think there has been a lot of convergence, and in a way, you've also seen some convergence on the US side, where the Biden administration has, in a way, in a slightly different formulation, adopted the Holy Trinity that the European Union came out with first. So there has been a lot of convergence. I do think that in many of these areas, and all the ones that were just mentioned, there will continue to be convergence. There is, of course, a big difference, and that is, the regional security perspective, that Europe simply has different, apart from France, which has territories in the region, most European countries just don't have that same regional security focus. So there's always going to be that difference. However, if it's done right, that doesn't have to stand in the way necessarily. That can be figured out. So, but there can't be total convergence. But on the issues that were mentioned, I would assume that it's going to continue in the direction of more similarities, and the conflicts that are going to arise are going to be more between the two partners than on China.
Thank you. Melissa, anything to add?
Well, always cautious about prognosticating, but how about I end on this big one, which is that if Trump wins in 3 years, which I believe if I had to bet today, I would say he would, that will necessarily change EU's relationship with the US, as we saw during his first administration. So that answer is very dependent on how US domestic politics plays out.
Thank you. So one last question. Both of you have recently commented on the unfolding case around Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai, and it was just announced that the Tennis Association has pulled out of China. One of our viewers is curious how this story is being followed in Germany and in Europe, and sort of what your take is on how this is being seen. Maybe Melissa, you can comment first on the story, and then Mareike.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to what's being covered in the US. I mean, people are generally horrified that a woman has come out to talk about being a rape victim and then suddenly being disappeared and then reappeared in controlled environment. But of course, like, it's the kind of story that reminds me that if you're sort of interested in China, you'll notice. But if you're not at all, it's just like does not even make the top 5 headlines for global news, right? So it's a reminder that sinologists follow this, and ordinary people might not even be aware it's happening.
Yeah, I think just quickly to add to that, I think it's good that the sports journalists have picked it up, because that kind of does bring the issue to a different crowd that usually follows sports issues. So now we have that semi-mainstreaming in that way. Other than that, I fully agree with Melissa that it's perceived quite similarly to how it's been perceived in the United States, that it's pretty shameful behavior on the part of the IOC, pretty great decision on the part of the WTA in actually pulling out. And I think personally it's just great, because next time somebody asks me what can I do, is like, well, here's a normal reaction, how we would normally react among human beings when one of our members gets kidnapped after making these kinds of accusations and gets held in the situation. This is, the normal reaction to do. So why don't more people do that, and more companies and more countries? Now we have an example that we can point to where we can say, this is the right way to do it. Please do as they have done. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, Mareike, I was thinking about what Melissa was saying earlier about leverage, and what you were saying just now about this being an example of the kind of leverage that one has in terms of trying to create change. Well, Mareike, Melissa, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. This has been a fabulous conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. Undoubtedly, there are a number of topics that we could have unpacked further. And hopefully we'll have a chance to reconvene in the not so distant future, because China is not going anywhere soon. I think both in the transatlantic context and beyond, we will be thinking a lot about China in the weeks, months, and years to come. So thank you both very much for participating in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.